Okay, first of all, good morning, and I want to thank the Foundation, Bank Inter Foundation, and particularly Monica for the invitation. At least I'm learning a lot. So I hope that I will also give you back some value added. But thank you also for all the presentations for this morning, because it was very interesting. I focus the presentation, so I will try to be also brief. Just to two comments. On who we are. I mean, you know the OECD, but maybe you know less a strange bird called the OECD Development Center. So I will try to say a word on that. And after to come very quickly on the substance and focusing on a region, Africa. ICTs, innovation, and Africa. Because we don't tend to think about, when we think about innovation, we maybe tend to think about other regions in the world, but here also, there's a lot of very interesting things, and we have been working on that precisely all the past year. So first of all, about the OECD Development Center. Well, you know the OECD. Basically, the OECD is an international organization headquartered in Paris. We are 2,500 people, the same size as the IMF. Within the OECD, there's one or two very specific institutions, like subsidiaries, if you want. One is the International Energy Agency, that probably you know, at least Chris knows it for sure, because it's dealing with commodity sectors, etc. The other one is the OECD Development Center, that we have a specific governance. And I don't want to bother you a lot with that, but it's pretty important to understand. We were created in 62, 63. For the ones that want to have a look at the website, it was an idea of Kennedy in the 60s. So we even found the images of the two-minute speech of Kennedy, saying with this idea to have a body within the OECD, bridging with developing countries, emerging countries. Our specificity is that, as you see, we have a board that is not the board of the OECD, is not the council of the OECD. You have OECD countries that are member of the governing board of the Development Center, not all, but you have also emerging developing countries that are member of the board. So if you have a look, for example, Israel is board member, Brazil, India, or Indonesia. We have a bunch of African countries. I will come on that also, Egypt, South Africa, Morocco, Mauritius. Well, you have the list here, and we have been expanding this board, precisely opening more and more to these developing emerging countries. Why I'm saying that? Because first, we are not the voice of the OECD, because the consequence of this is that obviously I do not represent, we cannot represent the 30 countries that are in the OECD. It's a bit larger, so we have a lot of autonomy. Intellectual autonomy, financial autonomy, operational autonomy in many range of activities. And basically we do three things. As the OECD, we generate and communicate knowledge, so it's statistics, analysis. This is the core business of the OECD and the Development Center also, in our case on Africa, on Latin America, on Asia. We, above all, do policy peer learning, best practices. And it's exactly what we are doing, by the way, this morning. I mean, sharing best practices, peer learning, it's exactly what we do, but with a policy twist in our case. And this is very important. Obviously, we strongly believe, and in the center, that best practices are not only in the OECD. And maybe the crisis is also a cognitive crisis, and maybe we can develop that. Best practices are in Singapore, are in Israel, are in Brazil, are in India, in countries that are or not in our board member, but this has also consequences, and I will try to explain with the substance. The third is that we try to be, I know that you didn't like the word, but maybe it's not the right word, an incubator of innovation within an international organization. What does it mean? It's not very easy, as you can imagine, to change this type of institutions, but we think, for example, we need to use much more the technologies to communicate. So, for example, we build wiki platforms, which is totally unusual for an international organization, a wiki gender platform, for example. We are thinking maybe the reports that we are doing, and not only the OECD, but maybe others, the type of reports that we are doing, maybe it's not enough and it's not sufficient. For maybe even for when we do a report, for example, on Africa, maybe we should use much more the iPhones, the SMS, etc. technologies, because it's very, very used in Africa. So we are thinking in that direction, and here a lot with private partners, private sector, so we work a lot with them. I don't have a lot of time to develop that, and it's not the purpose of my presentation. But where I want to come is just to give some points on Africa. This is one of the activities that we developed years ago. We produced the African Economic Outlook jointly with the African Development Bank and with a lot of think tanks in Africa. This is very important with think tanks because and the African Development Bank. Behind there's also capacity building exercise, transfer of technologies, so models. But the think tank's dimension is very important because here we are in an activity that knowledge is also power, and it's a pretty unbalanced. I mean, the way that we generate knowledge, I mean, it's very driven from the north. So it looks like a bit contrarian just to try to put much more, let's say, strength in the think tanks that are our partners. We are working, I mean, training, doing capacity building, for example, with the models, but we are thinking now in another stage, maybe to how we could help them in doing fundraising, communicating, marketing, etc. And it's not a marginal issue. Again, I come back to the crisis that we are living. This is a cognitive crisis also. There's a lot of asymmetries. Best practices are not only in the OECD. How you generate that, and obviously we do that in our teeny world, which is more knowledge world, think tanks, etc. The African Economic Outlook, so this was the project we started 10 years ago because there was a shortage of knowledge, macroeconomic knowledge on Africa. So it was the core idea to bring that. Again, we are doing it jointly with the Africans, with the African Development Bank. Every year we have a theme. Not only the macro, but a theme that is a sectoral theme, micro theme. So it can be water, it can be an entrepreneurship. This year is innovation and ICT. That's why I'm bringing that, because we were very happy to pick up this work jointly decided with the bank, because it's also a way to maybe think and look differently to Africa. Africa is not only, well, maybe the continent of aid, but is also the continent where there's a lot of innovation, business innovation, and I will try to pick up some examples, best practices maybe that there's in the continent. It's not exhaustive. Also to look at how ICTs can contribute to MDGs, a Millennium Development Goal. But again, focusing on how there was creation of new business models in Africa in very different sectors, in agricultural sectors, banking sectors, mobile banking. I think that we will come back tomorrow morning on that. E-procurement, for example. And what was also interesting, and we pointed here in the work that we did, and we are very interested by that dimension, is, again, it's not only a story where the investments are only coming from the North OECD countries. There's plenty of South-South investment here, activity, Indians investing in Africa, Chinese investing in Africa, telecoms and ICT sectors. So they are not only the Chinese looking to the commodity sectors, the Arab investors, so you have companies like Zain investing in the continent, but also the Africans themselves, very, very active at the frontier. Orascom Telecom from Egypt, MTN from South Africa. So it's not only the Vodafone and classical operators that are there, but there's very large density of South-South and even African investment. And if you take the banking sector, it's the same with Standard Bank moving in that direction, EcoBank and others in the continent. And obviously, telecoms, ICTs, well, probably will and are contributing maybe also to achieve broader objectives like the ones related to Millennium Development Goals. So here I will pick up, so I can stick to my 10 minutes now and even less, some examples. there's plenty. I mean, and I won't be listing all of them, but it's just to have an idea of the density of this innovation that is coming in the continent and using also the ICTs. On education, for example, there's projects like the NEPAD e-schools that are looking to connect the African village. There's also, so for children's, very interesting also Pan-African projects with the Indians. So again, this South-South dimension is not only North-South in the same range of activities. There can be also innovation that comes even for big multinationals from Africa. One very interesting case, and probably some of you know it, and you mentioned the laptop this morning, is Intel that was testing laptops in Africa, in Kenya, Nigeria, etc. And this innovation, by the way, they are using a lot of anthropologists in this corporation like Nokia and others, so it's a bottom-up innovation. And after, you have a transfer where this innovation generated on the ground from Africa, because you need specific product for the Africans that were adapted there and built there. After, they are diffused at a larger scale in OECD countries, for example, in Portugal and other countries that are now using this innovation also in their home market. So it's very interesting also to see this migration from the south to the north. So again, to have maybe a different view on Africa. Innovation also in agricultural sectors using technologies. Well, there's plenty of examples, you know them, in Peru or in India, fishermen that are using mobiles, etc., to adapt offer and demand. And this obviously generates a more efficient sales and of the products. In the case of Africa, there's also plenty of interesting examples. Esoko, for example, is collecting and distributing price information on crops to farmers, and they are using SMS and internets. What is interesting is this platform in Nigeria and other countries is built and using an innovation coming from a Ghanaian company, Busy Lab, that was incubated by the World Bank. And again, it's also Africans also spreading their own technologies and innovations. Mobile payments, I mean, tomorrow we'll talk about this. Africa is very at the frontier in e-banking and mobile banking. Why? Because simply you don't have the appropriate roads, infrastructure is lacking. There's problems of security if you can find a cash machine or a bank. If you find the cash machine of a bank, you have a problem of security. And you see, obviously, when you look at the density, here we took two estimates. The density of branch or cash machines, they are very low when you compare to OECD countries. So you have a shortage, a huge constraint that force to innovate and to move maybe and use these high-tech technologies, mobiles, precisely mobile banking, to develop the transfers in Africa. And this is very interesting because also maybe other regions of the world are looking to African experience to replicate the models in Latin America. But even in Europe, you have a partnership in Eastern Europe between Erste Bank, for example, and a South African company to replicate the model, some model obviously adapting to European markets, and in this case, Eastern Europe. This type of innovation, in this case of mobile payments, help also to lower the transaction cost. Here we compute some data for transaction cost in Africa. If you look at the transaction cost in the bankings, I mean traditional banks, where they are pretty high, obviously it's pretty related or correlated to the number of banks per corridor. If you go to the mobile transfer operators, you lower the transaction cost. And for example, in Kenya, M-Pesa mobile payments have been lowering dramatically the transaction cost in the financial transaction cost. And this is why this business model, in the case of Kenya, now is spreading in other countries of the continent. If you compare, for example, to Western Union, that you have a transaction cost reduced by more than 50% in this case. So again, innovation here in mobile banking, in banking sector, financial sector, e-trade. I won't extend a lot here, but e-trade is also very important because you run the risk to be out of the market very soon if you don't move in that frontier. As you know, OECD countries, in particular the Europeans, will be moving in paperless trade. So if you are not in that frontier in 5 years ago, you can be simply out of the market, of the trade market, classical trade market. And you have companies in for example, Senegal, local company Gain 2000, for example, that is already trying to provide end-to-end secure paperless customs and moving also I mean, in this case, Senegal and other countries in the continent in that direction. Again, e-trade is important for what I mentioned, and if you move to the e-trade, you need to do it quickly because you can run the risk to be in 5 years' time out of the market. And anyway, already the transaction cost, the trade transaction cost, when you look at time or cost per container in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, are very high. So it's a way also to compensate maybe this type of failure. I won't insist on e-government as an example. There's plenty of issues moving into that direction. One of them is the infrastructure needs in this continent. And for example, there's operations in East Coast now that will be connecting for the first time fiber optic submarine cables in the East Coast. There's other project in West Coast. I mean, you need the satellites, obviously, and you need to move into that direction. My last comment is about the policy challenges, because we are talking about a lot of business companies and two sectors. For example, if you take the mobile banking, one of the challenges is about regulation. That's why we are interested also, as you can imagine, because you have regulation failures. Here is my last comment on that, so I can stick on time. If you look at, for example, mobile operators, they generate a lot of revenues already in African countries. I mean, if you take some of them, Gabon, Tanzania, Chad, etc., we are approaching frontiers of 10%. So it's very important if you think in terms of domestic resources that are generated also by African countries for them. One of the problems, and this is a balance that needs to be achieved, is that the regulatory environment, at least perceived, but this is translated in true failures, is pretty inefficient. So it's inefficient in the telecoms sector, but it's also inefficient, for example, in the banking sector. So you have even a larger problem when you go to mobile banking, because you are combining two inefficiencies. So one challenge is precisely how you can organize, in a way, this type of policy peer learning, so you can maybe emulate some better regulated environment also for enabling these developments over the next years. And I will end just here. These were my value added, I hope, and at least comments. I would be very interested also in maybe knowing, because all of you work on Africa, maybe you have a lot of best practices to bring around the table, or even from other continents. So I will be also very interested in listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier.